Thank you. Thanks very much, Brian. I'm hoping I can have an extension of time to start with one short anecdote, which I think is probably apocryphal, but it might as well be true. I heard the story of a CNN journalist who went to Jerusalem because she had heard that there was a guy who had every single day for the last 60 years gone to the Wailing Wall to pray. Every single day, never missed a single day. And she thought this was a pretty good story, so she went there and she waited and she hung around, and she saw a guy who looked like he might be the guy, and she approached him and asked him if he was the guy, and he said, "Yeah, I'm the guy." And she says, "You've actually been here every single day the last 60 years? He said, "Yes." "You haven't missed a single day?" "No." "What do you pray for?" She says, "Well, peace in the Middle East." She says, "It's fantastic. I mean, what does it feel like to have been praying here every single day for 60 years for peace in the Middle East?" He says, "It feels like I've spent 60 years talking to a brick wall." And you'll understand why I start with that, because for a brief enchanted moment in July 2008, many of us thought that we had actually achieved something useful. On the 29th of July 2008, Senator Evans announced a new philosophy of immigration detention, key aspects of which were the abolition of temporary protection visas, which was terrific and still holds, the abolition of the Pacific Solution, which in practical terms had already gone, that detention should be as short as possible, and that detention of children would be a last resort. Now, fast forward, of course, it's easy to overlook the fact that when he announced that policy, there hadn't been any boats for a while. The generosity of public discourse about our treatment of boat people was conspicuously great as long as they didn't come. When the boats started coming again, the rhetoric about boat people slipped back pretty rapidly into what it had been before. So now, a couple of years later, 2.5 years later, we've got almost everyone being held offshore on Christmas Island. We've got gross overcrowding there and in the breakout detention centres on the mainland that have been set up or revived because of the numbers. Most people in detention have been there for more than 6 months. A very large number have been there for more than 12 months. Some have been there for more than 2 years. And there are just over 1,000 children in detention. Recently, in the last few days, we've seen, unhappily, riots and great physical destruction at Christmas Island. And the response of that has been on the ground. It's been the use of tear gas, and so far as I'm aware, for the first time in Australian history, we've had federal police firing shots at asylum seekers, at, frankly, anyone who's non-military. They've been using beanbag shot, which sounds kind of sort of 1960s warm and cuddly, but actually beanbag shot is number 9 lead shot wrapped in a fabric pillow. It's fired out of a shotgun. It's got a muzzle velocity of about 300 feet a second. It's designed so that it will not penetrate the skin, but because it hits with a fair wallop, it apparently will cause muscle spasm and bring a person to a halt pretty quickly, although it can be lethal, just like other supposedly non-lethal law enforcement measures can in fact be lethal. The shift from Evans's announcement in July 2008 through to the present could not be more dramatic, and frankly it's really not much better. In fact, I think it's not at all better than it was during the Howard years, with the one possible qualification that we've no longer got temporary protection visas. And the other difference perhaps is that the rhetoric is no longer about refugees being horrible, dreadful people and probably terrorists. It's now, who's the focus of attention? People smugglers. They're the vilest people in creation. But of course, if you put the people smugglers out of the game, what's the result? No boat people. So by demonising people smugglers, what the politicians are trying to do is to make sure that no boat people come. The reality in Australia is that people use people smugglers because even that risk is better than staying around for the Taliban to get you. The main cause for the shift, I suspect, was Tony Abbott taking over the coalition, because as soon as he took over the leadership of the coalition and ramped up the rhetoric, Rudd did a sort of perfect preemptive buckle, said he'd freeze the processing of Afghan and Sri Lankan asylum seekers, and the scene really did deteriorate very dramatically. In the same context, if you remember, he peremptorily announced that, notwithstanding Frank Brennan's recommendations, we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights for Australia. There are two major problems with the present situation that need to be addressed, and frankly, as Brian says, because we have a bipartisan approach to asylum seekers, it has to be addressed by people like you. The first is the fact of indefinite detention. Now, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? If you take people who have not broken the law, who are terrified and probably traumatised, and you then lock them up in circumstances where they're physically uncomfortable, although probably a little better off than they were in the Indonesian jail, but worse, they have no idea when, if ever, they will be released and begin to restart their lives. That creates immense psychological pressure. You know, you really don't need to be some kind of genius to work that out, and all of the psychiatric evidence supports it. The irony is that the pressure which it creates causes people to respond in one of several different ways. One is that they turn in on themselves and begin to self-harm, and the other is that they play out their aggression, and so you see the sort of rioting that we've seen in recent times. We have seen self-harm in detention over the last couple of years. Of course, we notoriously saw self-harm before, and you'll remember that yesterday, I think it was, a Hazara Afghan asylum seeker in Darwin hanged himself because of the pressure of this indefinite wait. Now, the irony is that Scott Morrison, when he sees people respond to the pressure by breaking out, he says, oh, they should go to the back of the queue. In other words, make them wait even longer, increase the pressure on them. You know, there's something truly Kafkaesque about the idea that you put people under so much pressure that they'll break, and then you punish them for breaking. It's truly outrageous, and it's mindless, and it's the worst sort of populism. One of the reasons for the extended time of detention, one which I want to talk about, pardon me for the moment, is that the ASIO security clearances are taking an increasingly long time, notwithstanding ASIO's vastly increased resources. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this because Lizzie O'Shea and I just recently finished a case in which the question was whether an ASIO assessment of 2 asylum seekers could be reviewed by the courts. These were the last 2 Iraqis left on Nauru in the wake of the Pacific solution. They'd been assessed as refugees. They were refused visas because they were assessed by ASIO as being potential security risks to Australia. They were not told why they were a security risk. We set up litigation in which the decision to adversely assess was challenged. Interestingly, once we set up the litigation, the ASIO heroes decided that they'd go back to Nauru and re-interview them. It took them longer than usual because the way you go to Nauru is to go to Honiara in the Solomon Islands and then across to Nauru. They had to spend 24 hours on the ground in Honiara because they'd forgotten to get Nauruan visas. It shows at least that if they can make mistakes, they're probably human. One of the 2 men, this put them in an impasse. It meant that they remained on Nauru because although they were refugees and couldn't be sent back, they'd been refused visas and couldn't be brought into Australia. One of them eventually had a mental breakdown. He was medically evacuated to Brisbane, and whilst he was in a mental hospital in Brisbane, ASIO changed its mind and decided he wasn't a security risk anymore, and he then got residency and has subsequently become a citizen. The other one was, after some months, accepted by Sweden, where after a 2-hour interview by their security people, they decided that he was not a security risk, and they've given him permanent residency. Both of them, however, had a burning sense of injustice. that they had been adversely assessed at all. ASIO's response in the litigation, which took a long time, and I don't have time to tell you all about it, but ASIO's response at the hearing was, first of all, it did not challenge their evidence that they had never in their lives done, said or thought anything that could fairly be understood as presenting any risk to Australia's security. Second, ASIO refused to put forward any evidence at all about the factual basis on which it adversely assessed. And their argument was, because you, the judge, haven't any idea why we adversely assessed them, therefore you cannot overturn the assessment. And the judge accepted that argument. It's truly chilling. Now, ASIO is taking at present between 6 and 9 months to perform its security clearance in this mysterious way, and there are already a number, I think about a dozen, who've been adversely assessed, more than a dozen, Lizzie tells me, who've been adversely assessed and who face the prospect, an appalling prospect, of being in Mr Al-Khatib's position, where they can't be removed because they're refugees, and they can't be given visas because ASIO has adversely assessed them, and even worse, they can't challenge the ASIO assessment because ASIO will take the stand that if it says nothing, its decisions can't be challenged. Now here you've got an arm of executive government with vast powers, which in a practical sense is holding itself wholly unaccountable in the courts. And that is so fundamentally dangerous to any democratic system that we all need to take steps to make sure it doesn't continue. The solution to all of this, in my opinion, and I've said this many times before, it feels like Groundhog Day, can I urge you to advocate initial detention only for health and basic security checks, capped at 1 month, capable of extension by a court if satisfied in a particular case that longer detention is justifiable. Then release into the community with full rights to employment, security, social security and Medicare, and on terms calculated to make sure they remain available for processing and, if necessary, removal. That way, instead of costing the country a vast amount in terms of money, as well as being a vast burden on our conscience, they can start to repair themselves and become contributing members of the community until, in the odd cases, I guess it would be about 6 or 8% of cases, they're found not to be refugees after all. That way, we will at least be acting decently, we'll be conforming to the standards that all other Western democracies expect, and we won't be building ourselves a burden on our conscience and our revenue for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian. We'll be having some time for questions at the end, so save them up. Well, there goes the time. Our next speaker is Professor Susan Kneebone. Susan is a professor at Monash, Professor of Law, but also Deputy Director of the Caston Centre, named after Ron Caston, who was the counsel in the Mabo case, a colleague of Julian's and mine. I think Julian and I have both done cases with him, and who died some years ago now, but left a wonderful legacy of using his career to further human rights. Susan brings not only her legal expertise but also an international focus, because she has researched this issue across national boundaries. And please welcome Professor Susan Kneebone.